There are few political phrases that carry the weight of the Reagan Revolution. The notion that Ronald Reagan's defeat of President Jimmy Carter in the 1980 presidential election marked a fundamental rightward shift in American politics. The term gained standing in early 1981 when two prominent journalists, Roland Evans and Robert Novak, published a book using the phrase as their title. "We seek here to outline," they wrote, "the most self-conscious effort at revolutionary change by any American president, surpassing Franklin Roosevelt in its intent, if not its scope." According to the argument, in 1980, the electorate rejected the idea that a strong federal government was a positive social good. The idea of the Reagan Revolution extended into the realm of foreign policy as well. Following a decade when the Democratic Party had withdrawn from supporting a robust national security state as a result of Vietnam, the argument goes, Americans grew tired of their weak approach toward national security. Reagan's victory thus represented the end of the so-called Vietnam syndrome. His administration pushed for ramped-up defense spending, launched military operations in Cold War hotspots like Central America, and deployed fiery rhetoric about the Soviet Union that shunned the principles of détente, the policy of easing relations with the communist superpowers that all three presidents in the 1970s had accepted. Whereas Democrats had led congressional investigations to curtail the power of intelligence agencies such as the CIA, Reagan supported covert action with gusto. Diplomacy was pushed aside for a more muscular stance toward adversaries. Just to be sure that people remembered the term, Reagan used it in his farewell address in 1989. They called it the Reagan Revolution. "Well, I'll accept that," he said, although he also reiterated that revolution was a return to the nation's natural state. But for me, it always seemed more like the great rediscovery, a rediscovery of our values and our common sense. Claiming that President Reagan was part of a revolution was no small thing. The term elevates the decade of the 1980s into something much grander than the normal transitions we expect to take place from one presidency to the next. Stipulating that these years constituted a genuine revolution, though bloodless, suggests the repudiation of political ideas, interests, and policies that came before. Everyone was a Reaganite by the end of the decade, or so his supporters claimed. When Reagan finished his term, advisor Martin Anderson published Revolution, the Reagan Legacy. If we accept Webster's Third New International Dictionary definition that revolution is a fundamental change in political organization, especially the overthrow or renunciation of one government or ruler and the substitution of another by the governed, Anderson wrote, then by any reasonable standard, what was happening in America was a revolution, not a violent physical revolution driven by guns, but a revolution of political thought, a revolution of ideas. Even a group of historians was swept up by the moment. The victory of a president who had come of age with the modern conservative movement represented the end of the New Deal era, they argued in a 1990 book, one that shaped the views of scholars for decades. The trope that a Reagan Revolution remade American politics has remained central to the national discourse. To conservatives, 1980 is the year one, recalled the political analyst Bill Schneider. Positing that there had been a clear revolution positioned liberals and progressive Democrats as being far off from the mainstream of the electorate, even when polls showed that their policy preferences matched where most Americans stood. Reagan shifted the political center by changing the terms of the debate, wrote the right-wing pundit Dinesh D'Souza in 1997. He made liberal a term of embarrassment, so that in 1988 the Democratic presidential candidate, Michael Dukakis, fled from the L word. Even as the Republican Party came to represent a shrinking segment of the electorate by the 2020s, rural white male voters, and a radicalized policy agenda that did not command broad support from the public, Reagan continued to be at the core of their origins story. Rather than talking about the centrality of institutional rules such as the Electoral College that enabled a shrinking party to hold power, conservatives spoke about a mainstream revolution in values. In a number of recent confessional works from Republicans reckoning with the implications of the Trump presidency, the Reagan presidency offers a model of when the party was pure. Conservatism dominated the landscape. For almost 4 decades, Gerald Seib wrote in We Should Have Seen It Coming, the Republican Party had been defined by a man, Ronald Reagan, and his movement, the Reagan Revolution. Reagan was the most unlikely of revolutionary figures, a modestly successful actor with a self-effacing style and no intellectual pretensions. Yet, Seib continued, he personally had made the Republican Party into a conservative party, and his legacy continued to inspire the movement's leaders, animate its policy debates, and stir its voters' emotions long after he left the scene. The history is more complicated than the term suggests. Indeed, the argument that there was a Reagan Revolution was born out of an explicit political strategy. The administration wanted to cement the impression that Reagan's victory had been a mandate for conservatism. Claims about a Reagan Revolution exaggerated the strength of conservatism and, equally important, the demise of liberalism. They also tend to conceal the deep fault lines that continued in national politics. The 1980 election conveyed a more nuanced message about the state of American politics, as did the entire Reagan presidency. Over time, a closer look at Reagan's presidency and the 1980s has revealed that liberalism remained much stronger in America's body politic than conservatives like to think. To begin, the implications of the 1980 election were muddled. Reagan won in an electoral college landslide, 489 to 49, although his margin in the popular vote was narrower, 50.7% to Carter's 41% and independent John Anderson's 6.6%. Reagan had secured just over half the vote in the election, and polls showed that a large part of that vote was as much about opposition to Carter as it was an endorsement of Reagan or his agenda. Over half of voters said they cast their ballot based on negative views of the candidates. 4 out of 5 of Reagan's supporters reported they made their decision in response to Carter's record as president. The great conservative realignment of 1980 was chimerical, noted Gil Troy. Only 28% of the electorate identified as conservative, only 13% as strong Republicans. Only 1 Reagan voter in 10 identified Reagan's conservative ideology as a key motivator. It wasn't just an unpopular incumbent at work. Reagan benefited from running after 3 successive presidents who had been remarkably unsuccessful politically. The 1970s had become a decade that deflated public confidence in the institution of the presidency, which had been revered throughout much of the 20th century. President Richard Nixon was forced to resign as a result of Watergate. President Gerald Ford held office for just more than 2 years. When Ford was unable to reverse stagflation or to restore confidence in the government, voters chose Carter to succeed him. Yet he also couldn't put together a coalition that would last beyond 1 term. His presidency ended with the nation frustrated about the economy, an energy crisis, and Americans being held hostage in Iran. Reagan's team worked hard to craft an optimistic and positive image of Reagan, and, in turn, the meaning of the 1980 election, that papered over the deeply divisive rhetoric that had been integral to Reagan's appeal in history. When running for governor of California in 1966, Reagan railed against the minority of beatniks, radicals, and filthy speech advocates, who he said were destroying the public universities, and he called city streets jungle paths after dark. In 1968, he would not condemn Alabama Governor George Wallace, the notorious racist who was running as an independent for president. And in the 1976 Republican presidential primaries, Reagan went after welfare queens for cheating taxpayers. Turning from the White House to Capitol Hill, the picture for Republicans was not as bright. Although Republicans gained control of the Senate for the first time since 1955, 53 to 46, Democrats retained a firm grip in the House of Representatives with a 243-seat majority. Under Speaker Tip O'Neill of Massachusetts, Democrats were determined to check Reagan. Although Reagan was able to pressure the House into moving forward with a major supply-side tax reduction in 1981, much of the rest of his legislative agenda stalled. With White House officials understanding the realities of the political landscape they faced, the president's early budgets did not aim to dismantle the welfare state. For all the furor they created, wrote his biographer Lou Cannon, the first-term Reagan budgets were mild manifestos devoid of revolutionary purpose. In 1982, the administration failed in its effort to reduce Social Security benefits. O'Neill mobilized a coalition that caused Reagan to back down. "They are ill-advised and unacceptable," O'Neill said. "It is unconscionable to create and exploit fears about the fate of the Social Security system so as to make deep cuts in benefit levels." Approximately 3/4 of Americans believed that Social Security needed to offer retirees an adequate standard of living. A majority felt that government spending on the program should increase, and there was overall opposition to cuts. When asked to choose between reducing Social Security and reducing defense, 3/4 chose to cut the military budget. The economic recession of 1982, which Democrats called the Reagan Recession, made his first midterms even harder than they normally were. After Reagan had promised that his tax cut would turn things around from the Carter-era's stagflation, the nation watched the unemployment rate go up, peaking at a whopping 10%. In 1982, Republicans like Kansas Senator Robert Dole joined Democrats to pass the Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Act, a bill that raised taxes in an effort to curb the growing deficit. When the Democratic majority increased to 269 in the midterm elections, the legislative challenge became even greater. Reagan found that on a number of fronts, such as steep cuts to social safety net spending or the elimination of the Aid to Families with Dependent Children (AFDC) program, Congress could just say no. At midterms, noted one reporter, the once dazzling political momentum of what conservatives enthusiastically called the Reagan Revolution has stalled. The realities of liberal power in Congress were not lost on Reagan's foot soldiers. Frustration drove a young Georgia Republican congressman named Newt Gingrich to promote a more aggressive and destructive form of partisan warfare. He argued that the Reagan Revolution never had a chance to succeed because Democrats retained so much power. Gingrich went after senior Republicans like Minority Leader Robert Mitchell of Illinois, insisting that their willingness to compromise and work with Democrats would permanently allow the opposition to entrench themselves in positions of power. Democrats used a spirit of bipartisanship and harmony as a polite cover to attract sympathy if we disagree with their version of reasonable, responsible compromises, all of which happen to be liberal and increase spending, weaken defense, increase bureaucracy, and raise taxes, he wrote in a memo. Gingrich's solution was to persuade his party to eliminate the guardrails so that they could take down Democrats and ultimately regain control of both chambers. Fired by the ideological zeal that helped carry President Reagan into the White House in 1980, reporter Stephen Roberts noted, they see their mission as confrontation, not conciliation. Gingrich's smash-mouth style of partisanship became the norm. But the welfare state endured. Reagan worked with Democrats in 1983 on a deal that raised Social Security taxes to shore up the program's finances. Federal spending reached 22.2% of GDP by 1983. It was 20.6% when he took office. Total welfare spending increased in the 1980s as the programs retained significant support in Congress. Means-tested programs provided higher benefits in 1990 than in 1982, including programs like Medicaid and food stamps, which didn't garner much love from the right. The federal workforce grew by more than 200,000 persons during his 2 terms in office. Abortion remained legal. Mr. Reagan is now seen as untrustworthy by many conservatives who believe he has betrayed his own principles in an effort to appease his critics, lamented the editor of the Conservative Digest. Throughout his first term, Reagan remained a deeply divisive figure in American politics. For most Democrats, Reaganism embodied a reactionary shift away from the basic social contract that had been created by FDR and LBJ. In their minds, Reagan had turned his back on the poor and the disadvantaged, rolling back gains from the civil rights era and redirecting public monies toward dangerous military escapades. Although recent commentators have depicted this decade as one where the president and his most ardent opponents, like O'Neill, could fight during the day and then have beer at night, feelings were anything but civil. O'Neill wrote in his memoirs that, "I've known every president since Harry Truman, and there's no question in my mind that Reagan was the worst." Nor was supply-side economics working. The premise that tax breaks for wealthier Americans and businesses would eventually trickle down to the rest of the nation didn't pan out. Instead, by the mid-1980s, economic inequality had become worse, and the deficit kept growing. Conditions were certainly better than in the 1970s, but many Americans didn't feel the benefits. In his historic keynote address to the 1984 Democratic Convention, New York Governor Mario Cuomo delivered a powerful message that captured this sentiment. Referencing Charles Dickens' classic work, he spoke about a tale of two cities that depicted Reagan's record as harsh, punitive, and profoundly unjust. There are more poor people than ever, more families in trouble, more and more people who need help but can't find it. Too many people were sleeping in the gutter, Cuomo added, where the glitter doesn't show. Reagan was able to soundly defeat Minnesota Senator Walter Mondale in the 1984 election, 525 to 13 electoral college votes. The president's campaign was conscious about selling the myth of Reaganism. The slick Morning in America television ad showed viewers images of suburban families enjoying a rebounding economy. Mondale's less charismatic straight talk, including his admission during one of the debates that he would raise taxes on Americans, didn't excite voters. Many parts of the country remained deeply Democratic, including the South, where the regional realignment of voters toward the GOP had not yet been completed. Reagan's sense of limitations felt that much more urgent after the 1986 elections, when Democrats regained control of the Senate. Moreover, throughout his presidency, the GOP was divided, which also checked his capacity to move the agenda. There were fissures separating senior legislators whose inclination was to keep working with Democrats and who accepted the permanence of the New Deal and Great Society framework, and younger renegades who were part and parcel of the conservative movement. As a result, Senate Democrats were able to find bipartisan support for issues like voting rights and the environment that didn't easily align with the conservative revolution that Reagan's supporters claimed to be underway. In 1986, Reagan worked with Democrats on a tax reform package that closed loopholes benefiting corporate lobbyists. He also signed a major immigration reform bill that offered amnesty to millions of undocumented persons. This didn't come as a total surprise to people who had followed Reagan's career, for he had been willing to cut deals with the Democratic California state legislature while serving as governor in the 1960s and early 1970s. Much of Reagan's conservative agenda in the 1980s was achieved through presidential power. The president relied on a combination of executive orders, many of which undid workplace and environmental regulations from the 1960s and 1970s, as well as staffing agencies with leaders who did not support the mission of their institution, such as Clarence Thomas, who headed the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, despite opposing affirmative action. He depended on freezing the budget so that social programs suffered a death of 1,000 cuts. Programs could not be updated, funding steadily shrank, and civil servants couldn't update their policies to new needs. Inaction also could serve the conservative cause. As the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, AIDS, crisis unfolded, Reagan's unwillingness to acknowledge the disease or to take any sort of action was in itself a proactive decision about what the government wouldn't do. The impact of Reagan's executive-based decisions was certainly significant. Regardless of the situation in Congress, the administration made a sharp dent in programs that affected these areas. Through adjustments to eligibility requirements, funding, and benefit levels, for instance, he cut social safety net programs by about 6 to 10% by the end of 1988. As with all executive actions, however, these changes were vulnerable. When Democratic presidents regained office in future years, they would take steps to strengthen the policies that Reagan had weakened, as well as revitalize the agencies that Reagan had harmed. Reagan's policy agenda didn't find the same kind of durable legislative support as Roosevelt or Johnson, thus remaining on more fragile political ground. Reagan's effort to revolutionize foreign policy was likewise contested. During his first term, Reagan's hawkish posture toward the Soviet Union didn't earn many fans across the aisle. The president was able to pressure Congress into vastly increasing defense spending, and he used blistering rhetoric when speaking about the Soviet Union. In one famous speech to a group of evangelicals in 1983, Reagan called America's adversaries evil. He staffed key diplomatic positions with figures who had spent much of the 1970s railing against proponents of détente who supported arms negotiations with the communists. Not everyone was on board with his militaristic mentality. As the president heated up the temperature of his program, Democrats warned that the administration risked triggering a nuclear war. Reagan had stacked his foreign policy team with staunch opponents of negotiations with the Soviet Union over arms agreements and staunch promoters of major operations in Central America to fight against socialist as well as other left-wing forces. Democrats believed that his bellicose posture was dangerous, and many Americans agreed. An international nuclear freeze movement drew massive support throughout the country in 1982 and 1983, and also around the globe. So much so that Reagan proposed an X-ray missile shield as his alternative, mockingly called Star Wars. More than 500,000 people turned out for a nuclear freeze rally in New York's Central Park, larger than any demonstrations during the Vietnam War. Massachusetts Democrat Ed Markey noted that what made the gathering powerful was that it demonstrated this was a middle-class movement. These are people with real clout in their communities. A 1983 television movie about the horrors of nuclear war in a small Kansas town, The Day After, turned into a sensation. More than 100 million viewers tuned in to watch. Public opinion also showed that there was limited support for using ground troops in El Salvador or Nicaragua, areas of conflict that served as proxies for the superpowers. From 1982 to 1984, the House passed the Boland Amendments, which prohibited the administration from sending assistance into the region. Despite such actions, the public remained nervous. A Washington Post poll of adults and teenagers found that in 1984, nuclear war was one of the top issues facing the nation. By his 1984 campaign, Reagan's closest advisers were admitting that much of the public was scared by his foreign policies rather than emboldened about his rejection of limitations. They urged him to show some signs to the public of his willingness to negotiate and to take down the temperature. Reagan listened. In an address to the United Nations General Assembly in September, Reagan sounded a different note from the person who had blasted détente. "We recognize there is no sane alternative to negotiations on arms control and other issues between our two nations, which have the capacity to destroy civilization as we know it." The next term would continue to be contentious. Following the 1986 midterm elections, the administration was engulfed in a major scandal that some in the administration thought could result in impeachment. High-level national security officials had run an operation to illegally send money to the Nicaraguan Contras, despite the congressional prohibition on doing so, by using revenue from secret arms sales to Iran, then considered to be the #1 terrorist state. Reagan watched his approval ratings drop faster than any other president since Gallup started tracking these numbers, 16 percentage points from October to December. Reagan survived the Iran-Contra scandal, but the investigations that ensnared many high-level officials were deeply polarizing. Many Democrats believed that the president was getting away with a scandal worse than Watergate, but one in which Congress was unable to find a smoking gun. Saturday Night Live aired a biting satire of Reagan, featuring the comedian Phil Hartman, who pretended to be an avuncular and kind president when in front of reporters, but as soon as they leave the room, he is a diabolical and ruthless commander-in-chief. "This is the part of the job I hate," Hartman's character yells after having to stop his meeting for a photo op with Girl Scouts. One of the greatest ironies of the presidency was that one of his most enduring achievements directly contradicted a key premise of the Reagan Revolution. After the tumult of Vietnam, the nation had embraced a muscular posture toward communism. When Mikhail Gorbachev emerged as the new leader of the Soviet Union in 1985 and called for negotiation, diplomacy, and a new era of more peaceful relations, he proved to be quite popular in the United States. Reagan, despite conservative misgivings, entered into ongoing negotiations with Gorbachev over nuclear arms. In the end, Reagan's biggest foreign policy success was to bring to fruition exactly what he spent most of his life working against: détente with the Soviet Union. Reagan and Gorbachev convened a number of high-level summits. One of the sticking points was Star Wars. Reagan insisted that the United States be allowed to continue the project. Gorbachev said it was a dangerous arms race in space. Reagan told Gorbachev that he couldn't give in on the shield because the people who were the most outspoken critics of the Soviet Union over the years, the so-called right-wing and esteemed journalists, they're kicking my brains out. When the president finally signed on to a major arms reduction agreement in 1987, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, conservatives were furious. The head of the Conservative caucus, Howard Phillips, decried Reagan as a useful idiot for Soviet propaganda. Reagan is a weakened president, conservative activist Paul Weyrich complained. Weakened in spirit as well as in clout, and not in a position to make judgments about Gorbachev at this time. In the coming years, Republicans would attempt to revise this history. They claimed that Reagan's insistence on peace from strength was the reason an agreement was reached. The conservative president, they said, had pressured the Soviets into an unsustainable military spending war and convinced them that he was serious about using massive military force if necessary. There have been others who emphasized the fact that Reagan had favored the abolition of nuclear weapons for decades and sought the breakthrough that happened in 1987 all along. These narratives mask the true nature of Reagan's achievement. When an opportunity for diplomacy emerged in the Soviet Union, Reagan was willing to break with his own agenda and the movement that brought him to power by changing course and accepting the centrality of diplomacy with adversaries. The idea of a Reagan Revolution made conservatism appear stronger than it really was, but the idea that there was a rightward revolution underway also helped to invigorate liberal opposition and activism. The gay rights movement that had already taken form in the late 1960s gained strength when organizations formed to pressure the government into responding to the AIDS crisis. As this deadly condition spread in the mid-1980s, hitting the homosexual community particularly hard, Reagan refused to even utter the disease's name. He started to change only in 1985, when his long-term friend, the actor Rock Hudson, died from it. But even then, there was little substantial change in policy. In 1987, the journalist and writer Larry Kramer founded an organization called ACT UP to mobilize grassroots pressure on the government to fund research and relax the drug approval process. In October 1988, with a growing membership, ACT UP closed down the FDA when more than 1,000 protesters surrounded the building, drawing international attention. The movement had significant effect. Reagan finally started to address the issue in public, authorizing Surgeon General C. Everett Koop, a staunch conservative, to undertake a massive public relations campaign that promoted condom use and safe sex. In response to grassroots pressure, the FDA would speed up its approval process and create an Office of AIDS and Special Health Issues to give patients a larger role in deliberations over new treatments. Other progressive movements thrived as well. Feminist organizations enjoyed newfound support as Reagan's stands enraged and galvanized a new generation of supporters. The National Organization for Women increased its membership threefold from 1979 to 1982, accumulating a budget of more than $13 million during this period. Hundreds of thousands of people marched in Washington in April 1989 to protest the record of his administration on women's reproductive rights. You know what happened in the 80s? Colorado Democrat Patricia Schroeder told supporters. Ronald Reagan got elected and said, "Put down your picket signs and put on your little dress for success suits." Well, a lot of people put down their picket signs and lost their rights. Suburbanization proved to be a breeding ground for certain strands of liberal politics. Although residential areas outside of the city accelerated racial and economic inequality, suburban communities often produced strong liberal pulses. Concerns about the quality of life were powerful in areas where parks, water, and air mattered so much. Affluent, well-educated Americans, according to Lily Geismer in her study of Massachusetts, were extremely supportive of feminism and anti-war activism. Communities mobilized to fight homelessness and to defend reproductive rights. As more immigrants created vibrant communities in the suburbs, white middle-class property owners became more accustomed and open to an ethnically pluralistic understanding of the country. Environmental organizations likewise expanded. The ferocity of the opposition to policies that were aimed to help business instead of the environment ended up strengthening the movement. The Sierra Club's membership increased to 364,000 in 1985 from 181,000 in 1980. By 1992, membership would reach 650,000. None of these developments surpassed the strength of conservative forces, such as the religious right, but the left remained a powerful presence. At the local level, protests took shape following incidents of racialized police violence against African Americans. When 6 transit police officers were acquitted in New York City in 1985 for the death of Michael Stewart, an African American who was drawing graffiti in a subway station before being beaten, bruised, and hogtied by the police, activists demanded justice. "Blood is on all your hands," protesters yelled outside the courtroom. Civil rights protest also formed in response to the October 29, 1984 killing of Eleanor Bumpurs, an emotionally disturbed woman in her late 60s who was shot when she wielded a knife as police entered her home for a city-ordered eviction. Activists established the Eleanor Bumpurs Justice Committee, a coalition of welfare mothers, community activists, and tenant leaders, all of whom organized protests when the police were acquitted in this case as well. "We say guilty," they chanted. Although the protests didn't coalesce into a movement akin to #Black Lives Matter, they built a foundation for later movements. The Reagan Revolution did not sweep through public opinion. In 1987, 53% of Americans thought that the government should do more to help the needy, even if that meant increasing the federal debt. 62% believed that the government should guarantee food and shelter for all, and 71% stated that the government should take care of people who couldn't take care of themselves. Though admired as an individual in many parts of the country, Reagan was not universally loved as a leader. His average approval rating was 52.8%, less than his successors, George H.W. Bush, 60.9%, and Bill Clinton, 55.1%, or predecessors such as Lyndon Johnson, 55.1%, John F. Kennedy, 70.1%, and Dwight Eisenhower, 65%. Reagan did beat out Nixon, 49%, Ford, 47.2%, and Carter, 45.5%, hardly the stuff of revolution. Before Reagan was in office, no president in recorded history had averaged over a 40-point gap in approval ratings by party during his term. Reagan's average party gap was 52%. Nixon's had been 41%, Ford's 31%, and Carter's 27%. The percentage kept rising after Reagan to over 50%, other than for George H.W. Bush. The coming decades would continue to see deep divisions over Reaganism. The congressional playing field would remain Democratic until the 1994 midterms, when Gingrich finally helped his party to secure victory. Despite that sea change, congressional majorities would remain narrow and competitive. Unlike most of the 20th century, one major political party would be unable to secure control of Capitol Hill for long periods of time. The Democrats and their liberal ideas retained a strong foothold in the legislative branch, as did the GOP. Political scientist Francis Lee has documented how since 1984, narrow and unstable congressional majorities have shifted back and forth with considerable speed, a dynamic that heightened partisan incentives on Capitol Hill and halted dramatic agenda shifts. In presidential politics, Democrats remained alive and well. To be sure, progressives argue that Democrats were able to rebound by shifting toward the center and abandoning key policy commitments, such as supporting unions. But the fact that the decades after Reagan would include two-term Democratic presidents, Bill Clinton, 1993 to 2001, and Barack Obama, 2009 to 2017, as well as another Democrat in 2021 with Joe Biden, constituted a strong rebuke to arguments about a revolution in the 1980s. All three Democrats might have displayed centrist tendencies and embraced elements of Reagan's agenda, Clinton proclaiming in 1996 that the era of big government is over, but all were far from liberal in their domestic policies and more skeptical of a hawkish national security agenda than the Gipper. None of them were part of the coalition that Reagan had put into place. The Reagan Revolution has been more of a political talking point than a description of reality. Although Reagan's presidency certainly marked an important moment and a major step toward a more conservative era, With the substantial push of policy and debate to the right, politics did not begin anew when President Carter left town. The 1980s, as well as the period that follows, was defined by competing ideological agendas and fractured political coalitions. It has been this way ever since. The conservative victories were powerful, but not a clean sweep. As David Stockman, budget director from 1981 to 1985, wrote in his account of the presidency, "The true Reagan Revolution never had a chance. It defied all of the overwhelming forces, interests, and impulses of American democracy. Our Madisonian government of checks and balances and infinitely splintered power is conservative, not radical. It cannot leap into revolutions without falling flat on its face." Reagan's presidency did not remake the nation, nor did it halt the powerful forces of liberalism that had evolved in the 20th century. As a result, when pundits in current times talk about the way Reagan brought the New Deal and Great Society eras to an end, they ignore the power of liberal policies and ideas. They don't explain why Tea Party activists protesting President Barack Obama's proposed Affordable Care Act in 2009 and 2010 would hold up banners that read, "Keep your government hands off my Medicare," a slam on proposed spending reductions in the program. All historical accounts that use the programmatic framing of a president and his supporters as an actual description of history overstate the level of change that occurred. But this is especially true with the Reagan Revolution, given the limited legislative agenda left behind and the fact that the period took place after many decades of huge expansions of policy under FDR and LBJ that were not easily taken apart. The narratives about a Reagan Revolution don't explain the roots of our current moment, and they overstate the dominance of conservatism. It's time to leave this flattened understanding of the 1980s in the dustbin.